Nintendo Worlds of Power, Blaster Master, created by FX9, written by A.L. Singer, read by Chris Randazzo. Chapter 1. Rebeek! Jason Frudnick stood outside the black door. Gray, steamy clouds whirled around his feet. He felt as if he were floating. Rebeek! There it was again. That sound was driving him crazy. Something was behind that door. All he had to do was reach out and turn the knob. But a voice inside him said, run away, or you'll be sorry. Instead, he took a step forward. He couldn't stop himself. His fingertips stretched towards the knob, but he yanked them away. It was turn back now, or... Rebeek! That did it. He couldn't stand it any longer. He had to find out what was making that noise. Lunging forward, he gripped the knob. It stuck to his hand, and a frozen slime oozed between his fingers. He turned it. In the night's stillness, the click of the latch sounded like a gunshot. With a deafening creak, the door opened. Inside the room it was black, inky black, the black of the deepest spot in the universe, beyond stars, beyond light. Cold fear shot through Jason. His blood turned to ice. He peeled his hand off the knob. He wanted to turn and run, but his legs moved him into the room. The darkness swallowed him. He looked around. Nothing there. The noise must have been in his imagination. Okay, time to go. Rebeek! Before he could move again, he saw it. It appeared in a blinding flash of light. Jason shielded his eyes. He couldn't see its shape, but he could tell one thing. It was huge. The size of a house. The size of a tyrannosaur back from extinction. Jason felt like an ant. A crumb. He knew he had to look at it. He had to see the thing that was about to destroy him. The light was forcing its way into his tightly shut eyes, and he opened them slowly into tiny slits. And what he saw made his jaw drop open in shock. He choked back a scream. It couldn't be. It was... No, he couldn't even think it. It was... Chapter 2. Thud. Jason fell to the floor. His bed wasn't that high, so it didn't hurt too much. Still, it was enough to wake him. He pulled himself out of the tangle of sheets. It was a dream, he said to himself. Only a dream. He felt his heart beating a mile a minute, and couldn't help but smile with relief. Thank goodness things like that never happened in real life. Rebeek! Jason's breath caught in his throat. The sound was real. It was coming from the box where Fred lived. Fred was Jason's pet frog. But this didn't sound like Fred. Fred's voice sounded more like ribbit most of the time. Sometimes if he got excited it was rebeat, but never Rebeek. Fred? Jason called out timidly. The morning sun was filtering through his blinds, casting stripes of light on the floor. It shone through the huge glass box on the table across the room, the home he had made for Fred. In the angle of the sun rays, Fred's shadow was a dark mutant giant. Was that you, Fred? Jason asked. Before he could even finish the question, Fred began jumping. Rebeek! 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 He was frantic. He was trying to leap out. Jason couldn't believe his eyes. Fred, what's the matter? Is something wrong? Fred began flinging himself against the glass, away from Jason, and toward the window. You want to go outside? Jason asked. Fred jumped up and down, continuing his strange shriek. It was as if he understood Jason. Jason was flabbergasted. He knew Fred was smart for a frog, but he had never shown signs of understanding English. Feed him, for goodness sake, Jason, came a groggy voice from down the hall. It was Mr. Frudnick, Jason's father, trying to get his Saturday morning sleep. Okay, Dad, Jason shouted. But he knew Fred didn't want to be fed. This was a stronger need, a need that would destroy Fred if it wasn't fulfilled. Rebeek! Things weren't going to be too terrific for Jason either if he didn't stop Fred from making that noise. And there was only one way to do that. Easy, pal, Jason said. I'll take care of you. He reached down into the high glass walls. From the bottom, the rich smell of the soil and mossy plants wafted upward. Jason had always been proud of the home he'd built, and Fred had seemed to love it. Until now. Jason cupped his hands around the frog and lifted him out. As soon as he set him down on the table, Fred squirmed away from him and jumped across the room. He landed on Jason's blue carpet and hopped out of the half-open door. "Hey, where are you going?" Jason called out. But Fred was already down the hallway. Jason followed him downstairs. Fred hopped through the living room, right up to the front door. "Reek!" Jason shivered. What was making Fred act like this? He felt as if he were his dream again, as if something terrible would happen if he opened the door. "What is out there, pal?" he said in a soft voice. Fred began jumping again, hurling himself against the door. His little body made sharp thuds as it bounced back. Okay, I'll let you out. I don't want you to hurt yourself." Jason opened the door. In one bound, Fred leapt over the entire porch. He landed on the front lawn, and in seconds he was in the street. Jason had to run at top speed to catch up, which wasn't easy in his slippers. All around them, the small town of Batrachia, New York, lay asleep. The lawns looked a little shaggy, and Jason knew that the mowers would be roaring in a few hours. It was a quiet, small town by the ocean, and Jason liked it best on the days when the wind blew from the south. Then you could smell gentle, salty breezes. But when it blew from the east, the air had a stale, gassy smell from the nearby swamp. Jason always kept his distance from the swamp. Everyone did. It always seemed creepy and slimy, and some people claimed that parts of it glowed at night. It wasn't the kind of place you ever really thought of visiting. But it was exactly where Fred was heading. "Not there!" Jason called out. "Come back!" Fred was way ahead, at the very end of Archer Street. There were no houses there, just a cyclone fence. Beyond it, as far as the eye could see, was the swamp. By now, Fred was a hopping silhouette in the orange glow of the rising sun. Through squinted eyes, Jason looked on in horror as Fred wriggled his way under the fence. He disappeared into the tall swamp grass, appearing again only at the top of each hop. Leaping over the fence, Jason landed in the swamp and started running. Actually, slogging was more like it. Before long, his slippers were sucked into the muck. Barefooted, he followed Fred into an area of bushes and scrawny trees. He pushed aside the spindly branches that whipped across his face. It was no use. Fred had vanished into the bushes. There would be no way to find him now. "Fred!" Jason was screaming now. This couldn't be happening. Not to Fred, his best friend. Not to the pet Jason had raised from a tadpole. Fred couldn't possibly survive in a swamp. "Fred, where are you?" Jason's answer came, but it wasn't a frog sound. It was a low, sinister hum to his left. Jason pushed aside some thick, overgrown vines and followed the noise. He came to another field. The grass here was pale, almost brown. It looked as if it had been scorched in the sun. There was a dull, sickly green glow in the middle of it. Jason cautiously approached. Soon he could see where the glow came from, a strange metallic box that jutted out of the ground. On top of it was a small shadow that seemed to be growing. It was in the shape of a frog. "There you are!" Jason shouted. "I thought I'd lost—" Jason cut himself off. He was sure he could recognize his pet anywhere, and this had to be Fred, but the size was wrong. Fred wasn't nearly that big. Maybe it was a trick of the rising sun, a reaction to the swamp gas. Jason rubbed his eyes. When he opened them, Fred was the size of a cocker spaniel. His little chest was puffing in and out furiously as he breathed, and with each breath he grew bigger, to the size of a wolf, a panther. Jason backed away. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Slowly, the box on which Fred was sitting began to sink, and as the top of his swollen frog head disappeared beneath the ground, Jason could swear he saw a look of fear and panic in his poor pet's eyes. And now, a game hint from your friends at Geekade.com. Level 2 earns the Crusher. Level 3 earns the Hover. Level 4 earns the key for Level 5. Level 5 earns the Diving Bell. Level 6 lets you walk on walls. Level 7 lets you drive on the ceiling. Level 6 actually lets you drive on the walls, because your car can't walk. You're in a car in this game. Spoiler alert. Chapter 3. No! Jason's desperate cry sliced through the morning air. The rising sun burned fiercely in his eyes. He raced into the field, stumbling blindly through the grass. He had only taken a few frantic steps when he slipped. He stretched out his arms, but it wasn't enough. With a sudden whump, he fell face first into the mud. Springing to his feet, he brushed off his face enough so that he could see. Then he ran to the hole Fred had sunk into. When he got there, he stopped short. It was much bigger and deeper than it had looked from a distance. A full-grown person could fit into the opening easily. He squatted by the edge and looked in. "Fred?" he called out. "Fred, Fred, Fred," was his answer, the echo of his own voice. Echo? Jason stared into the hole, which was the darkest black he'd ever seen. Like the black in his dream. How could there have been an echo? Dirt and mud would absorb sound, not bounce it back. Unless there was something else down there besides dirt and mud. Thoughts jumbled through Jason's mind. Should he call the police? No, they would just laugh. Should he get his parents? They would tell him to get another frog. That left only one choice. Jason knew it was crazy. But crazy problems needed crazy solutions, so Jason decided to do it. He jumped. Yeah! The scream tore up from his lungs. He was falling, picking up speed, as if he were in a race to the center of the earth. The darkness gulped him up, and he saw nothing below him. Swish! Suddenly, there was something underneath him, something like a slide in a playground. The cool, curved metal chute guided him on a sloping path downward. At the end of the slide, there was a shaft of dim light. He tumbled end over end, finally dropping through a hole. With a painful thump, he landed on a hard, cold floor. As he stood up, his bare feet tingled with the cold. His breath came in small white puffs. A steady drip, drip, drip echoed off the polished granite walls. The glowing metal chest was nowhere to be seen, and neither was Fred. Jason looked up to see the walls disappear high into the darkness. That was strange. The ceiling was pitch black, but the room glowed with the same bizarre greenish color as the chest. The light seemed to be coming from within the walls themselves. He turned around and saw tunnels leading in different directions. Fred must have gone into one of them, but which? Psst! Jason's heart skipped a beat. The sudden hissing sound made him leap with fright. He spun around. There was something in front of the tunnel to his far right. He squinted against the glare of the walls. It was long and low, and it pulsated with a low, rumbling sound. A vehicle of some sort. Jason carefully walked closer. Suddenly, a wing door opened on the driver's side. Jason froze. Out stepped a person. Actually, humanoid was more like it. It wore a shining bodysuit with a bubble helmet, and in its right hand, pointed straight at Jason, was a gleaming metal gun. Chapter 4. Jason's hands flew up over his head. I come in peace, he blurted. The figure came closer, keeping a tight grip on the gun. Who are you, and what are you doing here? Said a voice from inside the helmet. It wasn't the kind of alien voice Jason had expected. For one thing, it was definitely human. For another, it was definitely female. My name is Jason Frudnick. I came here to look for my pet frog. I saw him sink into this hole, and... You realize this is no place for humans. Jason nodded vigorously. Yes, I agree. I'll be happy to leave as soon as I find Fred. Fred? The figure cocked his head to one side. You do not mean frog. Fred is his name, Jason said. The figure let out a high-pitched giggle. You must forgive me. My mastery of your language is never yet complete. I noticed. She lowered her gun. With her other hand, she reached into the vehicle and pulled out a bodysuit identical to hers. Here, put this on. It will protect you from the cold and the radiation. Jason took the suit from her and began slipping it on over his pajamas. Radiation? Yes. How do you think these walls are eliminated? Jason furrowed his brow. I think you mean illuminated. I am apologized. Quickly, come into Sophia III, my vehicle. You do not need your helmet inside. Just a second, Jason said. I've told you who I was. Who are you? My name is... Seriously, in the book it says Yvtrkizj. She said, the closest equivalent name on this planet would be Eve. On this planet? Jason repeated. Is this a joke? I do not see what the yellow center of an egg has to do with this. Jason scratched his head. Oh, you mean a yolk. Quickly, Eve interrupted. There is no time for small talking. She jumped in. Jason pulled over the passenger door and hopped in next to her. Eve took off her helmet, revealing a cascade of long red hair and a freckled face. She looked like a typical American teenager. Jason's head was brimming with questions, but before he could open his mouth, Eve looked at him sharply and said, You must to wear your shoulder harness. Obediently, Jason reached for the strap. His eyes swept across a high-tech control panel in front of him. There were about a dozen levers and buttons on it, each with its own label. Gun, crusher, hyperkey, homing missile, thunder brake, multi-warhead missile, hover gauge, dive gauge, wall climber, ceiling transport. What are these things? Jason asked. They are weapon controls, Eve responded. Can you not read the labels? Well, of course Weapons? Hey, look, I'm just a normal kid from Long Island. Prepare for acceleration! Eve thrust her gear downward, and Sophia the Third took off, not gradually like a car, but with the force of a rocket. Yee! Jason felt his cheeks pressing backward with G-forces, baring his teeth. There was a sonic explosion as Sophia the Third shot through the tunnel. As the ship settled into a cruising speed, Jason felt normal again, and angry. He glared at Eve. Look, you've been ordering me around, expecting me to obey your every command. Now I want you to answer a few questions. Where is Fred? Where did you come from? Where are you taking me? And what kind of place... Jason was cut off by a sudden bone-jarring jolt. His stomach flip-flopped as Sophia the Third suddenly dipped downward and then back up. What was... Another jolt wrenched the ship. It was accompanied by a resounding boom! Eve slammed on the brakes, and Sophia the Third screeched to an instantaneous stop. Eve was silent, staring intently out the windshield. Jason tried to see what she was looking at. They were on a long, narrow cliff. In front of them were more cliffs, each one separated by a deep drop-off. On the second cliff, across the drop-off, there was a robot the height of a basketball hoop. Looking at the drop-off, Jason breathed a sigh of relief. There's no way you can step over that, Jason said. Let's get out of here. Incorrect on both counts, Eve said. Jason's eyes widened in horror as the robot leapt onto their cliff. Boom! Sophia the Third jolted again as the fearsome creature landed cleanly. He began clomping toward them. Each powerful step made Jason's teeth chatter. He's going to get us, he screamed. Fire at him, Eve yelled. Jason stared at the control panel, bewildered. He flicked the lever marked multi-warhead missile. Nothing happened. Boom! Came the robot's step. It was about 6 feet away. Fire! Eve demanded. Jason pulled thunder brake. Again, nothing. I can't! Jason looked at Eve, shaking with fear. Our power is gone! Brace yourself! Eve shouted. Before their eyes, the robot left the ground. When it came down, its heavy, solid metal boots were aimed straight at Sophia the Third. Chapter 5. Crunch! Sophia the Third sank a few inches. Jason looked up to see 2 clear footprints embedded in the roof. On Eve's dashboard there was a bright vertical gauge marked Power Supply. It had been lit all the way to the top, but now the gauge was lower. Crunch! The ship sank again. So did the power gauge. The dents in the roof were almost touching Jason's head. Hang up, Eve said. Jason knew what she meant. Hang on. He grabbed the handrest. With a roar of its engine, Sophia the Third lurched backwards. There was a bone-jarring thud as the robot landed on the ground. He is a heavy one, Eve remarked. We'll mail him a diet book later, Jason said. Now let's get out of here. The robot turned to face them, but instead of backing up, Eve drove forward. Wrong way, Jason shouted. Put it in reverse. He closed his eyes and braced for a head-on collision, but suddenly he felt a funny sensation, as if he were on an elevator. His eyes flew open, and he saw that Sophia the Third was leaping over the robot's head. Eve's hand was closed around a lever marked Emergency Jump. Jason let out a whoop of joy. Way to go, Eve! Don't count your turkeys before they're in the bush, Eve said, staring at the windshield. Before Jason could figure that one out, he saw what Eve was looking at. Another identical robot was headed their way. No sweat, Jason said. We'll jump over this clodhopper, too. Eve looked into the rearview mirror. No, they are both attacking now. We must blow them out. Away, Jason said with panic in his voice. Blow them away. All right, I will, Eve said. She leaned over to Jason's control panel and pressed the button marked Gun. With a sudden blast, a ball of light shot out of the gun port on Sophia the Third's hood. The robot in front of them was instantly pulverized in a bright explosion. Eve pulled a different lever, and the vehicle swiveled around. She leaned over and pressed Gun again. Another flash of light. Another robot bit the dust. Jason heaved a sigh of relief. So there is a weapon that works, he said. Yes, Eve replied, looking at the control panel. You see, the power for the special weapons must be— Look out! Jason blurted. Eve had taken her eyes off the road. Now Sophia the Third was heading right for the drop-off. It barged over the edge and began plummeting. Jason looked down and shrieked. Waiting at the bottom, bubbling furiously, was a pool of lava. Chapter 6. No! Jason shouted. He clamped his eyes shut and clenched his teeth. Oops, came Eve's voice. The falling sensation stopped. Jason felt seasick, as if he'd just hit the bottom of a roller coaster ride. He opened one eye a bit. The sides of the cliff were still racing by, but now Sophia the Third was going up. It bounded over the top and landed on the second cliff. How did you do that? Jason asked. To propel upward, Sophia the Third must have contact with a solid or liquid underneath. You mean we touched that stuff at the bottom? Jason said with disbelief. Briefly, Eve answered. If we had stayed any longer, we might have been social studies. What? Is that not a popular expression? Jason thought about it for a moment. You mean we might have been history? He laughed. I think I'm getting the hang of this. Jason's good mood was short-lived. They floated over a ridge into a valley below, directly into the path of another robot. You know, Jason muttered, these guys are getting annoying. He pressed a gun. Blam! The robot disintegrated. Jason smiled. I think I'm getting the hang of this, too. Hang up. Hang on. Getting the hang of, Eve murmured. Your sling is quite confusing. Slang. They came to another ridge, and Eve made the vehicle leap onto it. This time, when another robot came toward them, Jason didn't even blink. Your social studies, buddy, he called out, pressing gun again. The robot exploded. Yee-haw! Jason shouted with glee. The coast is The word caught in his throat. Where the robot had been standing, there was now a bright, pulsating sphere, the size of Sophia the Third. I lied, Jason said. Stop, Eve. But Eve didn't seem to hear him. She drove forward. Eve, Jason warned. Eve, don't you see the— But it was too late. Without slowing down, Sophia the Third plowed into the sphere. There was a blinding burst of light. Jason shut his eyes. Eve, are you nuts? But the light lasted only a fraction of a second. When Jason opened his eyes again, he noticed the power gauge had increased. I did not intend to become nuts, Eve said, frowning. I have tried to attain a suitable human form. You have, Jason said. Now can you tell me what just happened? In this highly radioactive underworld, there is much that is not understood. Sometimes, for unknown reasons, a destroyed robot will leave a pocket of self-contained nuclear power. And if we drive through it, we absorb that power? Jason said. You are getting the hang of this, Eve declared. Now, hang on. 4 gaping holes lay in front of them, and Eve carefully guided Sophia the Third over each one. Around them, on all sides, flying missiles whizzed by. What is going on here? Jason asked, his voice filled with exasperation. Eve shifted into a lower gear. In front of them was a long, dark tunnel. We will be safe in here, she said. I will explain all. Sophia the Third rolled into the tunnel. It was lit with a mysterious dull green, like the chamber Jason first had fallen into. He sat back and looked intently at Eve. She took a deep breath. My planet, Singar L, was very tiny, she began. There were many peaceful countries, all coexisting happily. You said was and were, Jason commented. Do you mean— Please, Jason, I said I would explain all. Eve's eyes grew distant as memories began to flood her mind. My father was the ruler of Pumblorg, the finest country on Singar L. He was also the leading astroscientist on the planet, and he trained me well. I became the youngest winner of the Nova Red Prize for Science for my theories of intergalactic life forms. Congratulations, Jason interjected. Eve gave a weak smile. I'm afraid it makes no difference now. You see, I was on a mission to seek out alien life forms when I found your planet. Needless to say, I was very happy, but when I transmitted the news to Singar L, my commander's voice interrupted me. All he said was, "Do not give your coordinates." Then the line went dead. Unfortunately, it was too late. I had told them exactly where I was. What was wrong with that? Jason asked. I had no idea, but I was more concerned with the signal blackout. I sped back to Singar L, and all I saw— her voice began to choke. She wiped away a tear. All I saw was a lifeless, glowing mass of radioactivity. The entire planet, every person, everything created during eons of civilization had been destroyed. I'm sorry, Jason said softly. Eve sniffled, then went on. As I approached Singar L, I tried to re-establish communication. There was a booming voice, so loud I had to cover my ears. I could not tell where it was coming from. It identified itself only as the plutonium boss. It laughed, and said it had found Singar L to be a delightful home. It had been on your planet all along? For thousands of years. Before that, it had been floating in space, dying for a lack of its only food. Plutonium. You mean that radioactive stuff they used to make atom bombs? Jason asked. Yes, this so-called plutonium boss said that it had burrowed deep underneath Singar L's crust ages ago, when he had first begun our nuclear age, when he had just developed plutonium on a large scale. And it fed on the plutonium for years and years, Jason said. Eve nodded. It grew and grew like a cancer, hiding underground. Then, after it had stored enough, it burst through the surface, unleashing the power of 3 million atomic blasts. Singar L was vaporized in an instant. Her eyes grew cold, and her jaw became set with anger. It laughed as it told me this, and then it thanked me. Jason was puzzled. Thanked you for what? For transmitting my coordinates to my commander. Eve turned and looked solemnly into Jason's eyes. Now that Singar L was used up, the evil creature's plutonium would decay quickly, sapping it of power. It would soon need another place to destroy. Another place that had plutonium. Another place where it could fester underground for ages. And after hearing my transmission, it knew it had found the perfect place. Jason knew what she was going to say, but didn't want to hear it. My dear Jason, Eve said, the plutonium boss is here, under the earth, and we are going to find it. And now, a game hint from your friends at Geekade.com. Use your cannon on the floating faces you encounter. That sure was helpful, wasn't it? Chapter 7. Jason stared grimly forward. His brain was spinning. All he had meant to do was chase after a pet frog. Now, all of a sudden, he was in a race to save the world. It doesn't make sense to me, he said finally. Why was there a hole in the swamp? And what was that weird chest in it? I do not know about the chest, Eve said, but I do know that in order to breathe, the plutonium boss requires a certain swamp gas. Methane, I believe. Is that the stuff that makes the swamp smell so bad? To the plutonium boss, that smell is like perfume. Jason scrunched up his nose. It figures. The hole you came down is one of the plutonium boss's blowholes, Eve said. For some reason, swamp creatures have been attracted to these holes, especially frogs. Several have fallen in. But why? Eve shrugged. Batters me. I think you mean beats me, Jason said. He sighed. And you were speaking so well, Eve. I am sorry, Eve said. Please, bore with me. Bear, Jason corrected. Eve looked around. A bear? Where? No, Jason laughed. You know, sometimes I think you're putting me on. Putting you on what? Groaning, Jason shook his head. Never mind. Eve ignored him, concentrating on the road. Before long, she pointed out the windshield at a distant pinpoint of light. We are almost at the end. Please be careful. This is where the other human got lost. Jason stared at her. Other human? I neglected to tell you about him. His name was Alex. Was? What happened to him? I do not know. On one of his solo energy-seeking missions, he never returned to the vehicle. I can only assume he was a casualty of the plutonium boss. Oh, great, Jason gulped. And, what is a solo energy-seeking mission? You will find out. Before Jason could react, Sophia the Third zoomed out of the other end of the tunnel. Suddenly, the ground beneath them disappeared. The vehicle flew through the air, landing with a dull bump. Around them was a dark grotto. The dirt walls were covered with green moss, and a heavy smell of mildew hung in the air. Okay, what kind of place have you taken me to now? Jason demanded. Greetings! Yarg! Jason cried out, covering his ears. The voice was so loud, he felt his seat vibrate. Plutonium boss, do not think you can scare us, Eve shouted. It is you who must fear us! A low rumbling laughter began. The walls around them shook with its rhythm. Don't egg him on, Jason whispered. Do not worry, Eve reassured him. There are no eggs on this vehicle at all. Yeah, Jason replied, shuddering. Just one big chicken. The laughter swelled, until moss began to shake loose from the walls. Jason thought there might be an earthquake. It stopped abruptly, and the voice spoke again. Welcome to the underground. Please feel free to turn around. But should you choose to forge ahead, heed this. The tour ends when you're dead. The traps are set for fools who dare. A dozen levels, save 2 pair. To find your host, plutonium boss, first go down and then across. Thence to your death and this planet's loss. The laughter welled up again, then faded. Jason heard a clattering noise below him. What's that? He exclaimed. I believe it's your feet, Eve replied. Jason looked down to see his boots shaking against the metal floor of Sophia the Third. I think we should leave. Do you not want to find Fred? Do you not want to save the Earth? Jason swallowed hard. Sure, but where are we supposed to go? I do not know. Perhaps there were clues in the poem. Jason thought back, remembering the words. A dozen levels, save 2 pair. Let's see. 2 pairs are 4, so that's 12 minus 4. 8 levels! There must be 8 levels in this underworld. Ah, now we are speaking, Eve said. But what did he mean by going down, and then across? Jason scanned the area. A few feet in front of them, a large hole dropped downward into blackness. Let's try that, he said. Eve took a deep breath. I suppose we must. It is like that saying, when the going gets tough, the tough go away. Right, Jason said. Just drive before I realize what a dumb idea this is. With a whoosh, Sophia the Third moved forward and dropped into the hole. Jason's body strained upwards against the shoulder harnesses. Outside the window was nothing but blackness. He felt as if he were in an elevator whose cables had been snapped. Near the bottom, Eve pulled a lever marked Landing Thrusters. Sophia the Third slowed down and touched the ground gently. Jason heaved a sigh of relief. You always do have something up your sleeve, don't you? Of course, Eve replied, looking at him as if he were crazy. My arm. Ahead of them was a long, narrow corridor, just wide enough for Sophia the Third. Eve edged forward. In the murky light, Jason spotted a rotting sign attached to the wall. It said, Level 2, and pointed straight ahead. Piece of cake, Jason remarked. I wonder if they'll all be this easy to find. Shee! A piercing shriek made Jason's hair stand on end. Sophia the Third rolled out in the end of the passageway and into a high, narrow chamber. Eve slammed on the brake. What is that thing? Was all Jason could say. Standing in front of a thick wooden door was a guard. Its eyes stared at them from high above, and when its mouth opened, its chin scraped the ground. It was a head. No legs, no arms, no torso, no body. All Jason and Eve could do was stare in shock. Then 3 deadly missiles shot out its mouth. Chapter 8. Shpak! Sophia the Third lurched backward from the full force of the hit. The power gauge dipped a full notch. Shpak! The vehicle jumped backwards again. It was at the edge of the tunnel now, and the power gauge was dangerously low. Fire back! Eve shouted. Jason drummed his finger on gun as fast as he could. A barrage of bullets shot toward the guard's open mouth. Thwack! 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 It was as if Jason were throwing popcorn in its mouth. The guard just swallowed the gunfire. Shpak! came the guard's return blast. Sophia the Third was thrown clear back into the tunnel. "We need better weapons," Eve shouted. "Let's get out of here." She put Sophia the Third in reverse and sped back along the narrow tunnel. Jason looked at the dashboard. The power gauge was almost at 0. Eve was looking too. "We were almost dead beats," she said. Jason nodded. "Dead meat." "No, dead beats," Eve responded. "I am a vegetarian." She tapped Jason's weapon panel. "Our mission is going to be treacherous. We must activate these weapons if we are to survive." "But how?" "In the underworld, there are many small chambers that Sophia the Third will not fit into. One person must go in, alone. These chambers contain the energy capsules necessary to power our weapons." "Hey, I'm there," Jason said. "Just point the way." "But I must warn you, these chambers are also full of deadly traps." "Oh," Jason suddenly lost his enthusiasm. Sophia the Third zoomed out of the tunnel. Jason breathed a sigh of relief, until he saw what was in front of them. It was a cavern. No, worse than that. It was a nightmare of a cavern. Its walls loomed high above as far as the eyes could see. Screams and shrieks echoed around them, sounding like needles scraping across records. Strange mechanical birds swooped down, releasing missiles of explosive energy. Along the walls there were long, flat ledges. Each one was patrolled by a robot exactly like the ones Eve and Jason had vanquished earlier. And directly in front of them, a sea of black water stretched out. The surface was covered with large bubbles. When Jason looked closer, he saw they weren't bubbles at all. They were glowing, radioactive jellyfish. "Eve," Jason said, "take us to one of those chambers. Anything would be better than this." Eve propelled Sophia the Third into one of the ledges, directly into the path of the robot. "Is this the way to a chamber, Eve?" Jason asked. The robot came ever closer. "Eve, what are we doing here?" "Fire, Jason!" Eve shouted. "No kidding!" Jason destroyed the robot, and a power orb hung in the air. Eve steered the vehicle through the orb. The power gauge went up a notch. Jason smiled. "I get it. You want to power back up to full before we go on." "You are really on the bat, Jason." "And you're on the ball," Jason answered. Eve guided Sophia the Third from ledge to ledge. Jason shot down robots and mechanical birds until the power gauge was full. When Sophia the Third landed on a high, quiet ledge, Jason hollered with joy. "We made it!" "Yes," Eve said. "Now would you like to go, or shall I?" "Go?" Jason looked out the window. A narrow door was concealed within the wall of the cavern. "Is that one of the chambers?" "Yes. One of us must venture inside. The other will stay with Sophia the Third." Jason thought about it for a moment. "Eve, you're the one who knows how to operate this vehicle. I think I should go." "A wise choice." She reached into a compartment under her seat and took out the small gun. "Take this laser blaster. With this, your helmet, and your wits, you will be protected." Jason knew if he didn't act fast, he might change his mind. He clutched the gun in one hand and opened the door with the other. "Thank you, Eve. I'll be back." "Don't take any wooden pickles." "Nickels. Those either," Eve replied. "Good luck." Jason gave her a salute. He turned to the door, tightened his fingers around the gun, and pushed his way through. Immediately he wished he hadn't. Whoosh! The moment he stepped into the room, he had ducked a flying missile. He tried to stand up, but another one just grazed his helmet. Jason quickly backed into the chamber doorway, where the barrage of missiles couldn't reach him. He took a close look at what was throwing them. He almost gagged. It was a one-eyed metallic blob with a coat of long steel wool hair. The missiles were flying around it in a wide circle, like bola balls. Jason knew there was no turning back. For the sake of Fred, for the sake of the world, he lifted his laser gun and fired. Pew, 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 pew! With a bang that shook the chamber, the creature disappeared. The only thing left was a thick wall of cement blocks. "Energy capsules," he muttered to himself, looking around. "I don't even know what energy capsules look like." He walked into the chamber, hoping they would appear magically. Nothing happened. Out of frustration, he took a shot at the wall. Pew! Instantly, a huge cement block turned to dust, leaving a gaping hole behind it. Jason could see another section of the chamber. Could it be the capsules were behind the wall? Jason squeezed through the hole to the other side and looked around. Nothing. He sighed. Maybe Eve should have come in after all. She would know where to look. He trudged back toward the hole, firing off 2 more rounds for target practice. Pew, pew, pew! 2 cement blocks vanished, leaving no trace. Pew! There it was, right where the 3rd block had been. It was a radiant sphere of energy. Inside it was a hologram of a fearsome electronic weapon. "Eureka!" Jason exclaimed. He walked towards it, hand outstretched. It shimmered when his fingertips touched it. With a strange electronic whimper, it disappeared. Jason felt his suit receiving its energy. Jason blasted his way through every block of the wall. There were 3 more capsules, and he picked up energy from each one. Feeling a surge of power, Jason ran out of the chamber. Eve was waiting patiently in Sophia the Third near the edge of a cliff. He leapt into the air, landing right near the vehicle. "Eve!" he yelled. "Guess what I—" But those were the only words he could say. The edge of the cliff gave out beneath him. He felt his body slip off. With a scream of terror, he looked downward. The murky darkness of the lagoon rushed towards him. In it, the radioactive jellyfish seemed to be quivering with delight. Chapter 9. Jason fell into the dark water with a loud splash. Down, down he sank beneath the surface. He held his breath for a moment until he realized he didn't have to. His suit and helmet protected him from the water, but not from the glowing jellyfish. They came at him, bubbling and beeping. With each pulsation, their tentacles shot out and then back in again. Jason had never been a good swimmer, but today he felt ready for the Olympics. He kicked hard and propelled himself backward. The jellyfish were slow to respond. Relieved, Jason flipped around and began to do an underwater dog paddle, and came face to face with another pack of jellyfish. He looked above and below. More jellyfish! They were closing in on him like a swarm of bees. There was no place to go. A shout raced towards Jason's lips, but he held it back. Down here, no one would hear him. Down here, it would be a quick, silent, cold death. A tentacle gilded toward him. He lurched backward. Yow! The tip of the tentacle brushed his suit. A jolt pierced through him. It felt like a lightning bolt. He wriggled right and left, barely avoiding tentacles. He scrunched his shoulders and pinned his arms to his side. And that's when he felt the gun. He hadn't thought of it, hadn't imagined that it might work underwater. He still wasn't sure it would. But he ripped it out of his holster and took aim. Blue, blue, blue! The noise was muffled underwater, but the laser darts made contact. Ploomf! The jellyfish disappeared, leaving a small whirlpool. Then another disappeared, and another. Jason's aim was perfect. One by one he picked them off. Yee-haw! He yelled, feeling like a gunslinger in an old western. It was time to get to the surface and find Eve. By now he had sunk so low the water was almost pitch black. He thrust powerfully with his arms and kicked. He felt as if he were standing still. He thrust again, and kicked again. This time he knew he wasn't standing still. The coral formations on the wall were rising, which meant he was sinking. It was the suit. He knew it. It was made for land travel, and it was too heavy to use underwater. He started to take it off, then stopped himself. The suit was the only thing keeping him from drowning. Helplessly, he flailed in the water until he suddenly stopped moving. There was something beneath him, something gooey. He planted both feet. They sank a few inches, but stayed put. He took a few steps, expecting to plunge off a ledge. If only he could see. As if in answer, a flock of beeping jellyfish appeared to his left. The glow cast a dull light around them. Jason could see he was at the bottom of the lagoon. He grabbed his gun and fired. One by one, the jellyfish exploded, sending out bursts of light. And in the last burst, Jason saw something that gave him hope. A ladder. Lifting his feet gingerly out of the muck, Jason trudged blindly onward. He kept his hands in front of him, feeling for the ladder. When his fingers closed around a wooden rung, he began to climb. And climb, and climb. The further he got from the bottom, the less dark it was. He stopped counting the steps at 300. By then, he could see the top. A tiny ledge jutting out of the wall, just above the water. There was barely enough room on it to stand. On the wall, covered by a thick film of seaweed and algae, there was a small door. It was either go through the door or go back down the ladder. It took about a half-second to make that choice. Jason ripped the seaweed away and pulled the door open. He stepped inside and cautiously looked around. There was a maze of pathways, formed by a twisting hedge of plants. He carefully followed along the hedge, going left and right, trying to see what was ahead of him. Never once did he look behind. And that was his first mistake. When the blast hit him, it was from behind. He felt himself jerk forward, but he never felt himself hit the floor. By that time, everything had gone completely black. Chapter 10. Ugh, Jason moaned. He had gone unconscious, and for a moment he had forgotten why. The second blast reminded him. It hurt like crazy. He scrambled to his feet and turned. A tiny metal machine was rolling toward him. It was shaped like a gumdrop, except Jason had never seen a gumdrop with a gun turret on its head. Jason fired a quick blast from his later gun. Ploomf! Came the muffled explosion. "You are now an ex-gumdrop, pal," he said. Keeping his gun out, he continued onward. He turned a sharp corner and vanquished 2 other gumdrop robots. He clung to the ledge, inching along a narrow corridor. At the end, he had to take a sharp left. There the path was cut off by a cement block wall. Piece of cake, he said to himself. Blasting his way through, just as he expected, some of the blocks contained weapon capsules. He stopped at each one, absorbing the energy into his suit. He wasn't sure what he was going to do with that energy, or how he would transfer it to the Sophia III control board, but he'd worry about that later. The pathway was blocked by more walls, and Jason blasted through every one. Finally, he came to the other side of the cavern and realized what he had come all this way to see. Another door. With an exasperated grunt, Jason kicked it open. Clang! 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 It felt as if someone were banging a gong in his ears. He cringed and backed toward the door. "Greetings, my friend. You made it," came the same booming voice Jason and Eve had heard before. Jason looked around, but there was nothing but an empty chamber. "What's the matter? You ran out of rhymes?" he asked out loud, mustering up his bravery. "It's difficult to feel poetic when I am preparing for a kill." The words sent a shiver up Jason's spine. "I'm not afraid of you," he retorted. He was lying. "My robots weren't afraid of you, and look what happened to them. I have had enough of your kind. Prepare to die." Jason lifted his laser gun. "Easy for you to say, swamp breath." A low rumble began. It seemed to come from within the walls and below the ground. Jason thought it was an earthquake, but as the noise got louder, he realized he was wrong. It was laughter. Sinister, ugly laughter that sliced through Jason like a knife. "Where are you?" he cried out. He was starting to shake. "I'll get you, plutonium boss!" The laughter became a wild, bellowing cackle. Jason whirled around, trying to spot something, anything. Then the chamber fell into darkness. The laughter swelled louder. Jason couldn't stand it another minute. He reared back his head and let out a scream that ripped his vocal cords. "No!" And when he opened his eyes, he was momentarily blinded, but in a flash of light, he had glimpsed his enemy. The sight alone was almost enough to make him pass out. He covered his eyes and staggered backward. He couldn't think. He could barely move, and even though he wasn't looking, he could feel it coming toward him. "I'll let you take one more glance," said his enemy. "Then I shall blow you off the face of the earth." And now a game hint from your friends at Geekade.com. After you defeat the first underboss, destroy the wall guard to get to level 2. Chapter 11. Jason slumped to the ground. He tried to take his arms away from his face, struggling to look at the dreadful thing before him. Suddenly, he was yanked off his feet. He flew in the air and landed several feet away. His head throbbed. His body was screaming with pain. He gasped for the breath that had been knocked out of him. He could no longer afford to cover his eyes. He had to see what was attacking him. Lifting his aching head, he looked straight at his adversary for the first time. His body tensed with the shock. It wasn't the glare. His eyes had adjusted to that. It was the sheer ugliness. 1 minute it looked like an enormous bloated mass of animal blubber. The next minute it looked like pictures of a tumor Jason had seen in a magazine, but it was alive, its lumpy skin palpitating like a human heart. Limp feelers hung like hairs of a scraggly beard. Its color was a putrid greenish yellow. As it throbbed, it turned red and gave out a groaning sound along with a sickening squish, squish. Fireballs orbited around it at lightning speed. They came within inches of Jason, and he scrabbled away. He realized it must have been one of those that had thrown him into the air. "Have a little laser fire, you mutant," Jason said. He aimed his gun and pulled the trigger. The laughter welled up again. "What was that? Did I feel the change in the wind?" the mutant blob thundered. Jason fired again and again. Each time the laser ricocheted off an invisible shield formed by the orbiting fireballs. As long as Jason was outside the orbit, he knew his shots would never penetrate. Would he be able to get inside the orbit? Would that work? There was only one way to find out. Stepping quickly, Jason walked towards the mutant. The fireball's orbit changed constantly, rising and falling. Sometimes it was at eye level, sometimes it rose into the air. He waited patiently for the right moment, watching the fireballs whoosh by with blinding speed. When the moment was right, he rushed in. Blue, blue, blue! This time the shots met their mark. The blob glowed bright white and swelled. It let out a high-pitched squeal. Jason was inches away from it now. He could feel the intense heat through his suit. Behind him, the fireballs were changing orbit. Their flames were beginning to lick at his helmet. He turned around and dove into the air. With a perfect commando roll, he landed on the ground and ran safely away. "I have been too nice to you," the creature boomed. "Now I shall crush you like a mosquito." Pulsing furiously, the blob came closer. Jason jumped away. His back slammed against a dirt wall. He slid against the wall, moving to the right. The creature came after him. Jason groped with his hands, not daring to turn around, hoping to feel a corridor opening. He never did. Instead, he found a corner. "Uh-oh," was all he could say. The creature roared with laughter. "Feeling cozy, I hope?" There was no place to go but forward. Jason lunged toward the creature, screaming a war cry at the top of his lungs. "Die, plutonium boss!" He barely missed being clobbered by a fireball. Stepping inside the orbit, he let loose a barrage of laser fire. The creature swelled and glowed bright white. Screeching, it tried to move away. It twisted and lurched, attempting to pull the fireballs inward. Jason copied it, move for move. His gritted teeth showed bright white within his helmet. His index finger clamped tightly onto the trigger. Now the creature was frantic. When it swelled, it gave off a horrendous odor like the swamp. Its raging skin bubbled at Jason, charring his sleeves. Blue! With an ear-splitting crash, Jason was hurled backward. Once again, he slammed against the wall. Intense pain ripped through him, followed by a naked terror. A fireball must have hit him from behind. He thought he had heard an explosion, but it was probably the ring of pain in his ears. The plutonium boss would be mad, real mad, and this time there would be no mercy. He bolted upright and faced the creature, gripping the gun with two arms. He held it rock steady and shot blindly. The laser streaked across the room and buried itself in the opposite wall. Jason dropped his arms. The room was empty. He could see the air pulsing with the spent energy of a destroyed radioactive mutant. I did it, Jason whispered, as if to convince himself, then louder. I did it! He dropped to his knees and began shaking with uncontrollable laughter. I, Jason Frudnick, killed the plutonium boss! He ran through the door and ran back through the other chamber. When he saw another gumdrop robot, he vanquished it with a behind-the-back shot. And the other end, he opened the door and stepped out onto the ledge. All he had to do now was find Eve. Maybe that wouldn't be too hard. He fired a laser beam into the air, tracing a wide circle. He did it to the left and to the right. If Eve were looking for him, she'd be sure to see it. And he was right. Within minutes, Sophia the Third appeared on a ledge above him. As he stepped back into the doorway, Eve maneuvered the vehicle onto the ledge. Her door flew open. "Any luck?" she asked. "Did you get some weapon power?" Jason grinned triumphantly. "We're not going to need it." "I beg your pardon?" Eve said, eyeing him curiously. Bubbling with excitement, Jason grabbed her arms. "Eve, I got him!" "Got him?" A look of astonishment washed across Eve's face. "You don't mean you killed the plutonium boss?" "That's exactly what he means," came an earth-shaking voice. Jason felt his stomach clench. The cavern shook with the plutonium boss's grim laughter. Chapter 12. "Who are you?" Jason called out into the void. "Who do you think I am?" the voice thundered. The ledge shook with the vibrations, and Jason and Eve clung to each other. The voice was different, deeper, more menacing. Jason couldn't help but tremble at the sound of it. But I destroyed you!" The laugh turned into a high-pitched shriek. Clods of mud and fungus dislodged from the cavern walls and began raining around them. Electrical sparks zigzagged through the air like lightning. When the shriek stopped, the voice bellowed angrily. "You thought that piffling pile of putrescent protoplasm was me? You thought that I, the plutonium boss, would let myself be outfought by a half-witted child?" "Well, I thought," Jason stammered. "Silence! I'll do the thinking here. The defective tub of lard you defeated was merely a mutant underboss. Being the weakest one I owned, he guarded the first level. So save your bragging, you simpering slush brain. There are 7 more deadly levels, 6 more underbosses between me and you. Somehow, I don't think we shall ever have the pleasure of meeting." The voice let out a cackling roar, then faded away. Silence hung in the air. Then slowly the distant cavern noises resumed. Robots clomping, wings batting, strange liquids dripping, electronic noises humming. "This is not going to be easy, Jason," Eve said. It was the understatement of the year. Jason knew he should be quaking with fright. He knew he should hop into Sophia the Third and beg Eve to take him home. But something had changed Jason. Something about the way the Plutonium boss had talked to him. Something about the sureness, the cockiness, the idea that Jason could be treated like a speck of dust. No one treated Jason Frudnick like that, and no one called him a simpering slush brain. "Eve," he said with his jaw set firm, "I will fight to the last breath. For Fred. For the planet. If the Plutonium boss is going to succeed, it won't be because I didn't try." Eve beamed. "You are a real sandwich on a long roll, Jason." "Hero," Jason said, too hyped up to laugh. "Sorry," Eve said. "You are a real sandwich on a long hero." "Skip it," Jason replied. "Let's go." He hopped into the passenger seat, and Eve took her place behind the wheel. Eve propelled Sophia the Third from ledge to ledge. They hopped into the paths of robots. They were attacked by swooping mechanical birds. They fell into the lagoon and fought jellyfish. Through it all, Eve guided the vehicle, and Jason shot down enemies one by one. Within minutes, they were traveling down the tunnel to the bodiless door guard. Jason flexed his fingers, preparing for the onslaught. Eve gave his weapon panel a gentle tap. "You'll be able to use this now," she said. "The weapons should be powered up by now." "But I didn't do anything," Jason said. "I mean, I picked up the energy, but I didn't transfer it." "Ah, but you did automatically, as soon as you stepped into Sophia the Third. You see, the vehicle's inner force field has been set to a constant flux between the occupant and the weapon reserve, sort of like an inductance coil." Right," Jason said. "I think I understand you better when you're tripping over slang expressions." "Never mind," Eve said. "I recommend that you greet our big-mouthed friend with the multi-warhead missile." Jason set his finger over the correct control. This time, when they entered the chamber, Jason let the weapon fly. Flosh, flosh, flosh! With each blast, 3 flaming projectiles shot out of Sophia the Third. They flew directly into the gaping mouth of the door guard. The guard's eyes widened in shock. He swallowed the missiles, sent out a few of his own, and then blew up. "No sweat," Jason said. "Onward to level 2, Eve cried out. She drove through the door. Sophia the Third sped through another dark tunnel, then plunged out to the other side. The vehicle's engine echoed loudly in this chamber. Instead of dirt and moss, the walls were solid, curved metal. It felt like they were in a huge pipe with a diameter the size of a football field. "Great," Jason said. "All that and we end up in the sewer." Clang! Sophia the Third bounced on its shocks. Its roof reverberated from the sudden hit. "Roof rockets!" Eve shouted. "How do I shoot them?" Jason demanded. "I'll tell you in a minute," Eve replied. "Let's get out of—" Suddenly, Jason braced himself. "Look out for that lava pit!" he yelled. Directly in Sophia the Third's path was a bubbling pool of red-hot molten rock. 1 second of contact and their vehicle would be sizzled to a crisp. Eve's index finger darted toward the emergency jump button. Just as the front wheels rolled over the edge, Sophia the Third lifted sharply upward toward the roof. Jason breathed a sigh of relief. "Eve, you're a genius." But Eve's face was turning a pale shade of white. "Uh-oh," she murmured, her eyes fixed upward. "I think I may have pressed a little too hard." Jason followed her glance. A forest of gleaming knife-sharp blades hung from the ceiling, and judging from the vehicle's speed, there was no way they were going to avoid it. "Duck!" Jason yelled, as if it would do any good. With a fierce screak of shredding metal, 3 long spikes ripped through the roof above Jason and Eve. And now, a game hint from your friends at Geekade.com. Once you get started, go straight to the ocean. That's how I feel pretty much every day of my life. Chapter 13. Jason pulled Eve down to the floor. The spikes tore deeper into the roof, inching toward them with sickening slowness. Jason and Eve sank further, scrunching their bodies into a neatly impossible position. Their frightened eyes were like 4 enormous white globes. The points edged closer. Jason could feel the pores of his skin closing up. Scrock! With the last wrenching noise, the spikes stopped. One of the points was inches from Jason's nose. He stared at it cross-eyed. "Eve," he said, "whatever you do, don't let me breathe." He grabbed the spike with his hand. Slowly, he angled his body around the point, until he was sitting in the passenger seat. Eve did the same, edging her way into the driver's seat. To see her, Jason had to look around 3 of the spikes. Now what? He asked. Eve examined the ceiling. Severe damage. We must somehow get down and repair this. How about firing some of our weapons? Jason suggested. The recoil might shake us off the ceiling. A creative suggestion, but we must not waste our weapon energy. Like a battery, it can be used up. Okay, then how about a little rock and roll? Jason said. Eve frowned. There is no radio on Sophia the Third. Jason began shaking forward and backward in his seat. I mean this kind of rock and roll. Together they lurched back and forth, and Sophia the Third began to rock. Reek, 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 reek. The serrated edges of the spikes held fast. We're only making the holes bigger, Eve said, looking at the gaps in the roof. That'll help us, Jason replied. He reached for the multi-warhead missile button. There's no other way. I'm going to use some weapon energy. Hang tight. A barrage shot out of the gun turret. Sophia the Third jerked backward. With an agonizing scrack, it pulled loose from the spikes and began hurtling towards the ground. Brilliant, Eve said, as she guided the vehicle to a safe landing. Avoiding traps, she maneuvered Sophia the Third onto an empty ledge. There, she and Jason got a hammer out of the trunk and banged the torn metal back upward into the roof. There were still holes, but they were smaller, minor damage compared to what would have happened if Sophia the Third had landed in the lava pit. They sped away at top speed. Here in the second level, there were side rooms, too. Jason stopped at these and picked up more weapon power. It was in one of these rooms that Jason met the second mutant underboss. Clang! 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 Sound was familiar, and this time Jason had more gunpowder. He braced himself for the flying fireballs, for the hideous mass of protoplasm. Come out, underboss, he shouted bravely. I'm ready for you. Are you sure? Answered the powerful voice of the plutonium boss. The sound jarred Jason. His confidence slipped, but he thought of poor Fred, who must have been suffering a horrible fate, if he was still alive. He thought of the innocent world above, where his friends and family were probably just now waking up to a gorgeous day. He thought about beaches and trees and ice cream and video games and books and 10-speed bikes, and he knew he had to stand his ground against the warped mind that wanted to take it all away. Sure, I'm sure, he said with firm control. Throw whatever you've got at me. I'm not running away. Laughter exploded around him. Then you're a bigger fool than I thought, roared the plutonium boss. There was a flash of light. Jason shut his eyes, but remained still. When he opened them, his enemy was facing him. He gulped. His grip loosened around his gun. There were no fireballs. There was no mass of protoplasm at all. Instead, there was a crab. A towering, grotesque crab, crouched and ready to jump. Laughter bubbled up again. I knew you'd like him, said the plutonium boss. I understand you have a weakness for obnoxious little animals. Jason shaded his eyes from the grotesque, overgrown creature. You can't scare me, he called out. He pelted the crab with laser fire and reached out to Jason, snapping with its claws. Jason rolled out of the way, springing to his feet and firing again. The crab took the hit, then opened its mouth. For a moment, Jason thought it would scream in pain, but it didn't make a sound. 3 spheres like cannonballs flew out of its mouth. Jason ducked. One of the spheres hit the wall next to him. It exploded, sending shards of metal into the air. Jason fell to his stomach. He held his laser gun with both arms extended in front of him. The crab monster swung its claws toward him. Jason took aim again. Pew, 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 pew! The crab monster exploded and echoed against the metal walls of the chamber, making the room shake violently. Jason tossed backwards. Acrid greenish-yellow smoke billowed up from where the crab had been. Jason leapt to his feet. He felt wrenched apart inside. It wasn't because of the tossing about or the smoke or the bruises all over him. It was because he imagined that somewhere in the plutonium boss's world, Fred might be waiting. Not the gentle pet Jason missed so much, but a hideous monster like the crab, transformed by the boss. Could it be? Where are you keeping Fred? Jason's voice was an anguished shout. It echoed emptily in the cavernous room. In the silence that followed, Jason had a terrifying thought. Maybe the plutonium boss didn't know who Fred was. Maybe Fred was just another pest that the boss had mutated or killed according to his whims. After what seemed like hours, the plutonium boss answered. His tone was gentle and soft, which somehow made it absolutely bone-chilling. Your Fred is doing very well, the plutonium boss said. Yes, indeed. Very, very well. And now a game hint from your friends at geekade.com. When fighting the ladybugs, shoot them as they come around the corner. Yes, when fighting enemies, shoot them. Brilliant strategy. Way to go, FX9. Chapter 14. Jason felt lightheaded, as if he were going to be sick. It had something to do with the plutonium boss's voice. The words were reassuring, but the meaning behind them wasn't. He wanted to feel relieved that Fred was alive, but he didn't. He hated to think it, but even death might be better than falling under the control of the plutonium boss. Jason shook those thoughts out of his head. He couldn't afford to stand still at a time like this. Blasting his way back through the room, he found the door and stepped outside. At that precise moment, Eve rolled by in Sophia the Third. She was going slowly enough so that Jason could pull open his door and hop in. "I got him," he said, landing in his seat. "Let's go to the next level." Eve didn't answer. She looked straight ahead as Sophia the Third continued its slow course. Jason settled into his seat. Eve must have been fatigued, and he didn't blame her. After all, she'd been down here fighting much longer than he had. He had to admire her, and he had to respect her feelings if she wanted to be quiet for a while. Still, it seemed a little strange that she wasn't accelerating at all, but Jason trusted Eve enough to know that she had something up her sleeve, besides arms. As they approached another lava pit, Jason didn't flinch. Now that they knew what to expect, Eve would simply make the vehicle leap over it. All she had to do was reach out and push the emergency jump button. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched her right hand. It wasn't moving. Sophia the Third rumbled forward. Its front wheels rolled over the lip into the pit. "Eve!" Jason shouted. "What is wrong with you?" He eyed the button, which was on the left side of Eve's control panel. He would have to reach across her to get to it. Instinctively, his arm darted out. As it did, it passed right through her, as if she were a ghost. Chapter 15. "Ah!" Jason cried out. At the same time, his finger pressed the button. Sophia the Third leapt over the lava pit in the nick of time. "Eve!" Stupefied, Jason stared at her expressionless face. She just stared ahead, unseeing, unhearing. He felt like he was looking at a movie of Eve, not the real thing. "Eve?" He tried to touch her, but his hand passed through again. He snapped his fingers inches from her eyes, but she didn't blink. Slowly, he felt his shock transforming into anger. "You can't answer, can you?" he said. "Because you're not Eve at all. You're some kind of image, some kind of hologram," blared the plutonium boss's evil voice. "Hope you didn't mind my filling the word for you. I was getting impatient. How does it feel to be all alone in the underworld, Jason?" Jason twisted his way into the driver's seat and took control of Sophia the Third. "Where is Eve?" he said. "What fun would it be if I told you?" the plutonium boss replied. "Clearly you enjoy this game of searching around. I've just made it a little more challenging." Fury welled up inside Jason. First Fred and now Eve. It wasn't fair. "Why don't you take me instead, you blowhard?" Jason shouted. "Go ahead, return Eve and Fred and take me. Let's just forget about the 6 other levels. I'll give you a fight right now. What's the matter, you afraid?" "Ooh, ha 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 ha." Once again the cavern shook with the thunderous laughter. "Afraid? You are still suffering from delusions. Precisely the opposite. The reason I haven't taken you is because you humans are too frail. I need tough species, ones that I can mutate into new forms and serve my needs. The last time I tried that on a human, he fell apart. Consider yourselves the most advanced form of life. Ha! I have much more success with amphibians, and of course, natives of that hearty planet, Signar L." The words hit Jason with sledgehammer force. They toughened his resolve, steeled him for the lonely battle ahead. "All right, you warped has-been," he hissed. "If that's the way you want it, fine. I'll see you at level 8. "More delusions!" the plutonium boss screamed. His laughter became shrill and high-pitched, boomeranging around Jason like the howls of caged hyenas. He forged onward. Within minutes he had figured out the controls of Sophia the Third. Level 3 whizzed by in a hail of laser blasts and vaporizing robots. There he was attacked by a group of 8 killer robots. Keeping his wits about him, Jason defeated them after a long battle. In level 4, Jason felt a rush of energy. When he got past this level, he would be halfway. He raced from room to room, leaving Sophia the Third when he needed to collect weapon power. The vehicle's power was becoming awesome. It could shoot in all directions, it could hover for long periods of time, it could climb walls and ride along the ceiling, and it could fire bullets that took curved paths to follow moving targets. The level 4 underboss was a frog that hopped wildly around him. Jason looked closely. It wasn't Fred. That was easy enough to see. It was a different breed, a grotesque and overgrown bullfrog, not the mild-mannered species that Jason knew so well. A long tongue lashed out of its mouth, glowing with a deadly nuclear energy. Jason hopped aside and bombarded it. When the frog monster disintegrated in a blaze of smoke, Jason fell to his knees. It was time to rest. His muscles were tight with fatigue. He sat on a twisted metallic piece of debris and stared at the floor. And at something that looked very definitely like an arm. A human arm, sticking out from a half-open door. Suddenly, Jason wasn't tired. He ran to the door and yanked it open. He stared in disbelief. He reached down to make sure what he was seeing wasn't a hologram. It wasn't. His hand made contact with a protective suit just like his own. Inside the suit, his head tilted lifelessly to one side, was a boy. A boy Jason knew. Chapter 16. Alex? The name escaped Jason's mouth before he had time to think. Eve had mentioned someone named Alex, but Jason had no idea it was this Alex. The slightly lopsided nose, the frizzy hair, the eyebrows that almost came together in the middle. Even through the helmet, Alex Buffoni's features stood out. The last time Jason had seen him was 2 weeks ago in school. Alex had been his typical weird self that day, making squeaky noises in the back of class, trying to convince everyone there was a mouse running loose. Now look at him, thought Jason. He had probably gone chasing after his lost pet, too, and suffered the consequences. Jason stooped down. He shook Alex's shoulders. "Alex! It's me, Jason! Alex!" 2 sentences popped into Jason's head. Something the plutonium boss had said. "I need tough species, ones that I can mutate into new forms that serve my needs. The last time I tried that on a human, he fell apart." With horror, it dawned on Jason that Alex might have been that human. It was Alex's voice. He was struggling to say something. Jason leaned in close. "What, Alex? What did you say?" Alex's eyes flickered open, shut, then open. He fixed a steady gaze at Jason. "I said, Ramth," he replied, stone-faced. "What's the matter? Don't you say Ramth when you wake up after being knocked unconscious?" Jason let out a howl of joy. It was Alex, all right, unmutated with that same sick sense of humor. "Ugh," Alex moaned, sitting up. "I dreamed that I had left this place. Or maybe that it was reality, and that this is a dream. And if it is, what are you doing cluttering up my dream?" "This isn't a dream, Alex," Jason said. "We're in some bizarre underworld created by the plutonium boss." Alex slapped his helmet. "Oh, right, of course. I'm looking for my pet lizard, while he's plotting to turn the Earth into a big charcoal briquette. You remember!" "Now I know I'm dreaming." Alex sank to the ground again. "Wake me up when it's over." Jason pulled him to his feet. "You have to come with me, Alex. We both got this far. Together we can beat the plutonium boss." "Where's, what's her name?" Alex asked. "The girl with the great car who dumped me." "Eve dumped you?" Jason said. He couldn't believe it. "Sort of, yeah. I fell in this hole, and she came at me with a gun. Scared me to death. Then she said she's from another planet, told me this wacko story about the plutonium boss, which I didn't believe, but I thought, hey, if I play along with it, she might let me ride in the car. Then we went through some long tunnel, which I thought was never going to end. I got really nervous. As soon as we got through, she insisted I get out and go through some door. No way, Jose, I thought. I got out and ran away. Next thing I knew, I was taken away by some big metal bird, and then..." His voice trailed off. "Then what?" Jason asked. Alex shrugged. "I don't remember. It's all a blur until I woke up and saw you." "Well, the important thing is that you're alive," Jason said. "Now let's go try and find Eve. She's in trouble." He turned to run, but Alex pulled him back. "What, are you crazy? What did she do to help me? Hey, I don't know about you, but I want to get out of here. I just got this new video game at my home, and I'm finally..." Jason cut him off. "This is more important than video games, Alex. If we don't get this plutonium boss, you'll never need to worry about video games again. There won't be a world left to play them in. Now come on!" Grumbling, Alex followed him. Together they went to Sophia the Third and climbed in. They found level 5. While Jason slew the underboss there, a lobster, Alex hid in a corner. At level 6, Alex finally began to pull himself together and helped Jason destroy that underboss. Driving through the tunnel to level 7, Jason could barely control his excitement. Butterflies crashed around in his stomach. His fingers tingled with anticipation. One more underboss, then they would come face to face with the most dreaded enemy the world had ever known. Just hours ago it seemed impossible, but it was going to happen. Jason knew it. "Are we there yet?" Alex whined. As Sophia the Third approached the end of the tunnel, Jason gave him a sidelong glance. "You know, Buffoni, you can really spoil a moment." "Hey, ease up. I was just The word caught in Alex's throat. Sophia the Third had just shot out the tunnel and into level 7, and it was unlike anything they had seen. This was no shiny metal sewer, no mud-clotted cavern. This was if they had taken a sudden detour to the North Pole, a frigid coating of white covered every inch. Icicles hung from the ledges that protruded from the walls of solid ice. On each ledge, each pathway, there was a crusty covering of snow. "Wow," Alex said, looking around with wonder. "There's only one thing missing, is Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer." There were some armadillo-like robots crawling around, which Jason recognized from other levels. Even though they could pelt Sophia the Third with ammunition, Jason considered them easy pickings. With Alex's help, he blew them away. In front of them, a long, white road stretched out. Alex sat back in his seat. "Wake me up when we get to the end of this road." Before he could close his eyes, Jason brought the vehicle to a screeching, skidding halt. Alex bolted upright in his seat. In front of them, like a winter sprite emerging from a blizzard, Eve was running toward them. She was waving energetically, and through her helmet, Jason could see a smile of relief on her face. "She's all right," Jason said, not quite believing it. Then, as she got closer, he shouted with happiness, "She's all right!" He looked over at Alex, expecting to share a scream of triumph and a smile of recognition. Something, but Alex's eyes were fixed grimly forward, and his finger was on the gun button. Jason panicked. "Are you crazy?" Alex didn't answer. He seemed to be taking aim. "This is a joke, right?" Jason said. "Look, I knew you were a little ticked off at her, but this really isn't funny." Jason reached over to push Alex's hand away, but it wasn't a joke, and Alex was quick and determined. With a firm press of the button, he sent a line of gunfire straight toward Eve. And now a game hint from your friends at Geekade.com. You must defeat each underboss in order to advance. Thank you so much for pointing out that you must defeat the boss to move on to the next level. Killer. Just killer. Chapter 17. With a bright blare of smoke, Eve went up in a miniature mushroom cloud. Sophia the Third recoiled with the impact, sliding along the ice. Jason's mouth locked in an open position. He stared, unable to find words to describe the horror he felt. "Well?" Alex said. Jason's eyes slowly traveled from the mushroom cloud to Alex. His mind was an overloaded jumble of pain, rage, shock, and sadness, all of which canceled each other out and became numbness. Alex rolled his eyes. "Aren't you going to drive?" "Aren't you going to drive?" Jason repeated as if he had forgotten how to speak. Then suddenly the words poured out in a torrent. "How can you ask me that? How can you be so calm, you murderer? She was the only survivor of her planet. She's the one who told us about the plutonium boss. Without her, there would be no chance for survival, and now you've gone and... Tears started to well up in Jason's eyes. He couldn't continue. Hey, easy," Alex said. "You don't get it." "What do you mean, I don't get it?" Jason was practically spitting his words now. "I mean, that wasn't Eve, Jason." "Don't play games with me. The plutonium boss did mutate you, didn't he? He's turned you into a ruthless killing machine." Alex grabbed Jason by the shoulders and shook him. "Earth to Jason! Earth to Jason! Read my lips! That wasn't Eve." Jason just stared at him, his rage turning to confusion. "The minute I saw her, something came back to me," Alex continued. "I remembered something from that last time I thought I forgot." He knitted his brows, reaching into the recent past. "The plutonium boss. I met him. Or at least I think I did. Although I can't picture how he looked. He brought me into some sort of genetics lab. He wanted to do an experiment on me or something." "A mutation experiment," Jason said. "Like what he did to make those underbosses." I guess," Alex said. "Anyway, he kept complaining about me. He said I was too weak-hearted and couldn't keep conscious, which must have been right because I barely remember it. But there was something else going on in the lab, some new kind of imaging." "Huh?" "He was using nuclear magnetic resonance imaging, something like that. If he needed to hide something, he could project a moving image over it using the nuclear magnetic rays. It looked real, but you could tell it wasn't. Something about the color, the way it glowed." "You mean Eve was..." Jason said. "Why didn't he just use a hologram?" Holograms are okay for close-up, Alex said, but from a distance you can see through them, which is what we were seeing, such a small nuclear bomb disguised with an image of Eve. So how come you could see her and I couldn't? Alex shrugged. I guess I've been down here so long my eyesight's been, sensitized to radioactivity or something. Amazing, Buffoni, Jason said with a smile. You saved our lives. Hey, I'm not as stupid as I look. Just then, Sophia the Third was thrown backward by a cannon blast. Jason and Alex had to get back to work. They blasted their way forward, destroying sinister ice monsters and self-propelled gun turrets. Alex was having the time of his life. Hey, this isn't so bad after all, he shouted, picking off an ice monster with ease. I wouldn't mind staying here a while. As Sophia the Third approached a sudden drop-off, Jason jammed on the brakes. Don't speak too soon, he warned. The vehicle went into a skid right over the edge. Jason and Alex were both thrown to the left as Sophia the Third slid down a long, icy spiral. They picked up speed until all they could see was a white blur. Stop us! Alex screamed. Jason tried the brakes, but there was no traction. He pressed emergency jump, but the vehicle just banged against the tunnel ceiling. Sophia the Third barreled downward and slid to a stop at the bottom. Only their shoulder harnesses kept Jason and Alex from flying through the windshield. Jason exhaled with relief. He looked out at their surroundings. A small chamber with ice block walls. In the center of it, covered with frost, was an arched double door. I want to go home now, Alex demanded. And I've had enough of this. Jason grabbed his door handle. Come on, Alex. I have a feeling we ain't seen nothing yet. Reluctantly, Alex followed him to the double door. There was a huge metal ring on each half of the door, and above each ring a sign said, No trespassing. Maybe we should knock first? Alex said meekly. Jason grabbed one of the rings and pulled the door open. A blast of frigid air greeted them. With a loud whoosh, Jason and Alex were both knocked off their feet. I wish they'd turn down the air conditioning, Alex said with a weak smile. They picked themselves up. Jason led the way in. Howling winds swirled above them. They looked up. Blades of ice jutted out of the walls, forming crystal caves and catacombs. Shadows danced and fitted like bats. Aside from the wind and bizarre squeaky noises, there was silence. Come on, Jason, Alex pleaded. There's nothing here. This is probably not even the plutonium boss's jurisdiction. Rebeek! The noise startled both of them. They looked around and saw nothing. I know that noise, Jason said quietly. Rebeek! Now there was a knocking sound, from behind the wall on their right, from behind a door on the wall. This can't be, Jason murmured. What? What? Alex said. You're getting weird on me all of a sudden. Rebeek! This is just like my dream, Jason answered. He approached the door. The icy, slimy knob was there. Just as in the dream, he was gripped with fear. He didn't want to face what was in there. Couldn't face it. No robot, no monster, no underboss, nothing compared to the horror of this creature. But in his dream, he never did see the creature. Or did he? The end of the dream had been so terrifying that Jason had awaked rather than face it. This time, when Jason opened the door, he would be wide awake, and there was no escaping. He grabbed the knob, felt the icy stuff oozing between his fingers. With a mighty pull, he yanked it open. Pitch black, inky black, black hole black. Nothing, just like the dream. Let's get out of here, Alex whimpered. For a moment, Jason agreed, but only a moment. He stepped forward, looking up into the suffocating darkness. When he spoke, he said 3 well-chosen words. Come get me. Rebeek! The shriek almost pierced his eardrums. Alex yelled in pain. A blinding burst of light shattered the blackness, and there before them stood the last underboss. Jason drew his gun, then dropped it. He fell to his knees. No, I can't. The underboss came nearer. It loomed over them, its tongue lashing in and out of his mouth. Kill it, Jason, Alex shrieked. But Jason just bowed his head. He could vanquish robots without a second thought. He could turn underbosses to dust. Nothing would make him happier than destroying the plutonium boss, if he had the chance. But he couldn't, just couldn't raise his gun against his own frog. The 7th and last underboss was Fred. And now a game hint from your friends at Geekade.com. Use curved bullets to kill the bullet machine on level 2. Sure, why not? Curved bullets. Bullet machine. Love it. Chapter 18. What is happening to you? Alex's voice was getting closer. Give me the laser! Jason spun around and grabbed the gun. Don't you touch him, he said through his clenched teeth. Alex stared at him dumbfounded. Jason, he's a monster. He's going to kill us. Do you want to die? I hope not, because I will be really angry if you leave me alone down here. A long, fiery tongue whipped out of the creature's mouth. It brushed against both Jason and Alex, flinging them across the room like paper dolls. Ah! Alex cried out, tumbling head over heels. He landed next to a 10-foot-high granite boulder. Wincing with pain, he looked up at Jason. Now are you happy? Gee, it sure is fun getting knocked against a humongous rock. Maybe next time he'll throw us through it. The creature was eyeing them from across the room. It squatted on its hind legs, then sprang into the air. Its shadow enveloped the white floor in black. Jason and Alex looked up helplessly at the mammoth amphibian plummeted back toward them. Alex grabbed Jason's arm. Come on! He pulled Jason behind the boulder. They fell to the floor. When the frog landed, the room shook as if it had exploded. Now, would you mind coming to your senses? Alex demanded. Or at least give me your gun so I can blast that ugly thing to pieces? Jason looked up at Alex. His eyes were rimmed with red. The fierceness in his face had melted away. All that was left was this shattered, lonely boy. Alex, he said, his voice cracking, that ugly thing is my pet frog. Alex backed off. He stared at Jason for a second or two, processing that statement. Then, measuring his words carefully, he said, Jason Frudnick, you have truly gone wacko. Maybe you ought to stay here and cool out for a second, while I'm serious, Alex. Sure, Jason. You kept him in your garage, right? Special garage, 4 stories high, with padding on the ceiling to cushion his head when he jumps. Jason grabbed Alex's shoulders. Listen to me, will you? You know the kind of stuff the plutonium boss is into. Genetic engineering, nuclear mutations. He turned my little pet frog into that thing. Rebeek! There was a loud cracking noise on the other side of the rock. Fred was trying to knock a path around the edge. How can you be sure it's him? Alex said. I just know. When you've been with a pet every day of his life, you get to know him like a person. If Fred were in a room with all the other frogs on Long Island, I would be able to tell him apart in a second. Alex nodded. Yeah, I felt the same way about Plutarch. Plutarch? My pet lobster. Alex lowered his eyes. He was the 5th underboss. So you knew I wasn't crazy all along? Jason said. Why didn't you say anything when we were in level 5? Rebeek! The rock shook. Fragments of granite shot upward from the other side of the rock. If Fred couldn't get around, he was going to blast his way through. I didn't say anything, Jason, because it really wasn't Plutarch. But you just said, this is my point, Jason. Our pets are gone. The minute the plutonium boss began changing them, they became something different. Robots, killing machines, whatever personalities they had or history, pal. Just remember, you are no longer looking at Fred. You are facing a creation of the most evil creature the world has known. We've destroyed all his underbosses, and now he's trying to prey on our weaknesses. He knows we'd never fired our own pets. But he's wrong, Jason, because Fred and Plutarch are dead. He killed them. And you know what? If they could, they would be cheering us on right now. Rebeek! The entire top of the boulder flew off, crashing into the wall to their left. They dove to the ground for cover. Jason reached for his gun. When he sat up, his face was set with grim determination. You know, Buffoni, I never thought I would hear you say something that made sense. Alex smiled. We're in this together? Let's go, was Jason's reply, holding the laser with 2 hands. He stepped around the boulder. He planted his feet in firing position. The creature that was once Fred turned to face him. His mouth was twisted into a horrible leer. Smoke billowed out from between its lips. Before it had the chance to shoot out its tongue, Jason opened fire. Rebeek! Rebeek! The scream sliced through Jason from his head to his toes, by the way of his heart. The force of the explosion threw him backward. The light was as intense as 5 suns. Ice and dirt began falling from the ceiling. Huddled on the ground, he thought about time travel, going back, taking back the shot, if only he could. When he looked up, he caught a last glimpse of Fred, more gas than solid, vaporizing before his eyes. On Fred's face was an expression, clear as day. It was a look of shock, fear, and betrayal. The same look Jason had seen when Fred had disappeared into the swamp. His head turned towards Jason, and he let out a tiny, helpless ribbit. The next moment, Fred was gone. Chapter 19. No! Jason's voice was raw with emotion. Then, with the force of a megaton blast, he understood what he had just done. A scream welled up from the bottom of his gut. No! A falling chunk of ice just missed his head. "Come on, let's get out of here," he heard Alex shout. Jason wheeled around. "You lied to me," he said. "That was Fred. Or at least there was some of him left. Some hope. But now he's—" More ice and soil spat toward them as a wall suddenly collapsed. Alex grabbed Jason by the wrist. "Later for that. This place is caving in." Jason realized his friend was right. Fred was gone, but now they had to save their own lives. They ran out of the door and into the outer room. There, blades of ice were raining from the roof like oversized sleet. "What a way to go," Alex shouted. "Impaled on an icicle!" It was getting harder to maneuver. The ground was covered with piles of debris. Jason fell, then Alex. The outer door was now 20 feet away. Alex moaned, "My ankle!" Jason pulled him up. He put an arm around his friend's shoulder. "Here, lean on me." Together they began hobbling to the door. But it was too late. A refrigerator-sized chunk of ceiling fell in front of the door. "Great," said Alex. "What now?" Jason opened his mouth to answer, but he was interrupted.
"What now? Do you think you have a choice?"
The force of the plutonium boss's voice alone was like a dynamite blast. Jason and Alex were flattened against the floor. There wasn't time to think. Then Jason and Alex were lifted off the floor. They hovered in the air as if supported by invisible hands. "What the—" was all Alex could say before he and Jason began to move. Through the air. Through walls. Through tunnels. At blinding speed. They passed through every level, every room. All the robots, all the enemies they had faced now stood motionless, silently watching Jason and Alex speed by. They shot toward granite walls, steel walls. Each time they covered their heads, but when they passed through, they didn't feel a thing. Somehow they were being protected. They were traveling in another dimension. They were being saved for something. And when they stopped, they had an idea of what that something was. Standing before them was the plutonium boss. And now a game hint from your friends at geekade.com. After you defeat the underboss in level 6, get the wall walking power, go back to level 2, and find the secret door for level 7. Chapter 20.
"Welcome, my human friends. You are made of tougher stuff than I expected."
Up close, the voice was unbearable. Jason covered his ears and dropped to his knees. He couldn't look. Part of it was the brightness, so intense that it seemed to burn through his eyes. But mainly Jason was shielding himself from the very appearance of the plutonium boss. The first underboss had been a hideous, boiling mass of nuclear matter. The others had been horrible mutations of pet animals, but they were nothing. In fact, compared to the plutonium boss, they were almost beautiful. Through slitted eyes, Jason forced himself to look at his nemesis, the monster who had destroyed his beloved Fred. First, there was the head the size of a building. 2 huge muscle lumps were where the eyes should have been. Fleshy folds rippled down the center of the head, ending in a gruesome mouth surrounded by horns. The mouth was in constant motion, dripping fireballs revealing jagged, dagger-like teeth. Its chin tapped the ground, sending out sparks. The head had no body. Instead, 2 muscular legs jutted out from each side. They curved outward, then hooked downward to the ground. At the knee joints, sharp spikes glistened. Gnarled feet clutched the ground with wide, sharp claws.
"What's the matter?"
the plutonium boss taunted, fire spitting from its mouth.
"Do you not find me attractive?"
"Get it away from me," Alex said. "I hate rats." Jason looked at his friend. "Rats? Where do you see—"
"Silence!" the plutonium boss cut him off. "I must admit, I underestimated you humans. You have proven to be much, much stronger than expected. What you did was a feat of courage and cunning. Perhaps you are now afraid that your journey is in vain, that I will simply vanquish you right now. But you are wrong. I intend to reward you."
Jason and Alex exchanged an uneasy glance.
"For this honor, I have chosen only one other person."
Rocking from foot to foot, the plutonium boss stepped aside. Jason and Alex both froze. Neither of them had paid attention to what was behind the plutonium boss. Now they saw. It was a white, curved wall stretching out and away from them on both sides for what looked like miles.
In the center of it was a giant metal door covered with gauges, switches, and pipes. Chained to one of the pipes, looking haggard and exhausted, was Eve. "Jason," she said. Her voice was hoarse. "He is a rat," to Alex. "To me, he is a horrible flying predator from Singar L. To you, he's something else. The plutonium boss actually has no form visible to the naked eye. He takes the shape of something that he knows will frighten you. For each person, the form is different." Jason didn't know what to say. Was she real? She had to be. The plutonium boss had no need to fake him out anymore. He turned to the boss and drew his gun. "You rotten coward!" "Jason, no!" Alex shouted. "He'll kill us all!" Jason ignored his friend. He fired. The plutonium boss took the full force of the laser blast. Nothing happened. There was no color change, no scream of pain. He simply opened his mouth. Out flew a brilliant flare of light. It shot directly toward Jason's hand. The gun went flying away and clattered on the floor. "Yah!" Jason looked down at his hand. It was untouched, except for a slight black mark where the gun had been. The plutonium boss's laugh once again assaulted his senses.
"A peculiar way to show gratitude, especially after I have deemed you worthy to test my new creation."
What are you talking about?" Alex stammered.
"The structure before you is my cyclotron. With it I will be able to accelerate my plans for the Earth. No more waiting around for eons like I did at Signar L. I will be able to create enough atomic energy to wipe out the planet immediately."
He roared with self-satisfaction.
"However, in my haste to build it, I have not been able to test it adequately. I need a few volunteers. Say 3.
"Count me out," Alex snapped. "Just point me to the nearest blowhole and I'm out of here." Suddenly, Alex began moving toward the cyclotron. Not walking, not running. His feet were dragging on the ground, as if he were being pulled. "Hey!" Alex's upper body struggled to throw itself in the opposite direction. "Hey, what's going on?" Jason looked down. The same thing was happening to him. His eyes widened with terror as the cyclotron loomed closer. Suddenly, some of the switches on the door started to move by themselves. A whirring noise began. A red neon sign flashed, "Cycle beginning." The dull green glow around them diminished. Even the plutonium boss seemed to become duller, lighter color. The cyclotron was sapping the energy of the entire underworld. The radiation from the walls, the power of the robots, all of it was being drawn into the white machine before them. All of it was collecting inside the door. "No!" Jason and Alex shouted as they were drawn closer, but there was no defense. In seconds, they would be ripped apart without a trace. Chapter 21. "Jason, look!" Eve screamed, clinging to the pipe for dear life. "Look at the boss! He's using his reserves of nuclear power to start up the cyclotron." "Of course," Alex yelled. "What else can he use? There are no electrical outlets down here." "But he needs that power for himself, too," Eve answered. "He's nothing without it. Look at him." Jason glanced over his shoulder. In the room's dim light, the plutonium boss seemed to be flickering. For a split second he glowed brightly, then sputtered. Jason looked downward. Despite the diminished power, he was still being dragged along. Not as strongly as before, but strongly enough to prevent his escape. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw his laser gun on the ground. It was only about 5 feet away. If he could only tear free of the boss's hold. With every last ounce of strength, he threw himself toward the gun. There was a zzz sound, a breaking of some sort of field. Jason hurtled through the air. He landed inches from the gun. Instantly, he was jerked back up again. The invisible field was pulling him with double the force. But his fingers were now wrapped around his laser gun.
"You are wasting your energy,"
the plutonium boss called out, his voice half the volume it once was.
"Those bullets have no effect on me."
"Maybe not on you, dinosaur face," Jason said. He swung the gun around toward the cyclotron wall, pointing it at a spot near the boss. "But it looks like your great invention is made of Earth materials." He took careful aim. Pew, pew, pew! A large hole ripped through the cyclotron wall. The plutonium boss fell to the ground with a resounding foom. He began sliding toward the hole. The cyclotron's energy was pulling him in. His scream made Jason's skin tingle. Jason, Alex, and Eve all fell limply. Eve's chains had vanished. They were free. "He's using all his own energy to save himself," Eve said. "Let's run." A sudden explosion tore up the ground, inches from their faces. They spun around.
"Die, you insects!"
the plutonium boss shrieked. 3 pulsating energy orbs shot out of his mouth. Poosh! 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 Jason, Alex, and Eve dove away. Scrambling to his feet, Jason pointed his gun at the boss. His shots hit their mark. This time, the boss let out a cry of pain. The cyclotron's power was picking up. The boss flailed his legs helplessly. Green and yellow sparks discharged from the pores of his skin. As he slid toward the hole, he left a trail of glowing purple slime.
You cannot escape,
the boss said. 3 more energy orms burst out of his mouth. Jason shot at them, deflecting them midair. The boss was now at the hole. He swung his legs around. He braced them on either side. The suction of the cyclotron pulled at his face body, stretching it, making its horrible features even more grotesque. He pulled against it, letting out a furious howl. Then, with a sickening pop, the plutonium boss was sucked inside. There was no time to feel relief. The cyclotron began to rumble furiously. There was a high-pitched squeal. A sign on the door flashed, "Malfunction, structural damage." Huge chunks of stone and dirt began falling around them. "Here we go again," Alex cried out. "This is for real," Jason said. "That thing is going to blow." "Let's get out of here," Alex yelled, grabbing his 2 friends' arms. Eve pulled him back. She looked him in the face, sweat pouring down her brow, making rivulets past her bloodshot eyes. "There's no place to go. Don't you see? When the cyclotron explodes, the world goes with it." Chapter 22. Sudden bursts of energy rattled the entire area. The cyclotron was chugging, wheezing, popping, shaking. The ground shifted and vibrated. Jason was seeing double. His stomach was turning. There was one thought in his mind, one thought only. We set out to save the world, and now we're destroying it. Struggling to keep his balance, he walked toward the cyclotron. "What are you doing?" Eve shouted. "Shutting it off," Jason replied. "How?" Alex said. "I don't know." Jason was at the door now. He grabbed a lever and pulled. A wild pinging noise began, making the machine shake even more. The next instant, Alex was by his side. "You're making it worse," he shouted. Alex began yanking levers and pressing buttons left and right. Eve joined them. Together they frantically punched, jabbed, and turned. The machine only churned even more violently. It sparked and spewed gases. Then an explosion ripped another hole in its side. All 3 of them were blown backward. They landed in a heap 15 feet from the machine. The sign on the door flashed. "Overload! Overload! Overload!" Jason braced himself for the end of the world. Chapter 23. When he opened his eyes, he saw Alex and Eve hunched over the ground. They were covering their heads, waiting. The air was filled with flying debris and thick smoke. Piles of rocks and metal littered the ground, but something was different. Through the smoke, he peered at the cyclotron. The bright sign had stopped flashing. He got up, picking his path carefully. He walked toward it. There was rumbling, but it was distant. It wasn't coming from the cyclotron. Or was it? He was a few feet away from the door now. He brushed away the smoke with his hands. The gauges all rested at 0. The lights were out. The beeps were silent. The cyclotron was dead. He turned around and yelled at the top of his lungs. "We did it!" He ran back to Alex and Eve. Both of them were straining to see him. "We made the cyclotron burn itself out," Jason said. "It's off! Kaput!" There was silence for a moment. Silence that was followed by a loud crack of a collapsing wall. Mud gushed out toward them. "And so are we," Alex said. Eve grabbed both of them. "Follow me!" The 3 of them ran, making their way through the surrounding chaos. Eve took them through smoke-filled tunnels, doors that had been blown apart. At the end of one corridor, a metal door remained tightly shut. "Sophia the Third is in here," she said. Alex shook his head. "No, Jason and I left it." "It's in here," Eve insisted. "The plutonium boss was a loudmouth. He told me all his little secrets, like his plans to turn Sophia the Third into his own underground pleasure vehicle. When he brought it to the cyclotron, this room is where he brought Sophia the Third." "Step back," Jason said. The others obeyed, and he blasted the door open. Sure enough, Sophia the Third was sitting there, waiting, with a solid chunk of granite on its hood. A solid chunk of granite that had smashed its engine. Jason's heart sank, but Eve just ran up to the hood. "Help me," she said. "There's an auxiliary rear engine, but we'll go faster without this thing." With every ounce of strength, the 3 of them managed to push the rock off. They jumped inside, and Eve started a spare engine. It let out only a meager whine, but it worked. Eve steered out of the room. "Do you know how to get out?" Alex said. "Up," Eve said. "Other than that, beats me." They zoomed through a jagged hole in a nearby wall. They emerged into a cavern Jason recognized. It was level 4.
Concentrating on every detail, they were able to retrace their steps. Level 3 was empty. Mud poured through holes in the walls, and short-circuited robots were flailing on the ground. Level 2 was unrecognizable. Twisted remains of the metal walls lay on the ground like shipwrecks. Level 1 was by now a churning pit of lava and slime. They raced through the final tunnel and into the chamber where Jason had first met Eve. At one end, Jason could see the bottom of the blowhole chute. "Let's see if we still have some of that weapon power," Eve said. She reached over and pressed the hover gauge. Sophia the Third left the ground. It shot into the chute and slowly rose upward through the blowhole. Around them, the side of the hole trembled. Jason looked up. There was daylight. It was far away, but it was there. Behind them, the blowhole was caving in. Its walls were bursting, spewing oil and rocks. Eve kept her finger on the hover gauge, but Sophia the Third was slowing down. "I don't know if we're going to make it," she cried out. "I can see the surface," Jason replied. "Just hang on for a little while longer, please." "I don't have any control over it," Eve shot back. And she was right. With a sputter and a groan, the hover power died. In fact, the entire vehicle died. They seemed to stand still for a moment, and then they plunged toward the pandemonium below. Chapter 24. Thunk! Sophia the Third had stopped. It wasn't until then that Jason realized his eyes were slammed shut and his teeth were clenched. He unshut and unclenched. What the? They were on solid ground. Solid ground that had filled in the blowhole. Above them, sunlight streamed in through the opening in the swamp. "Doesn't do us any good to sit here," Alex said. "Let's go." The three of them left the vehicle. The sides of the hole were sloped upward to the top. They were sticky with moist earth and clots of grass. Perfect footholds. In minutes they reached the surface. Jason took a deep breath. The midday sun blazed down, releasing gases from stagnant pools of water. In the heavy humidity, mosquitoes buzzed around, happy to find 3 victims. At this time of the year, the swamp was at its worst level of odor and infestation. To Jason, though, it was beautiful. "We made it," he said, half believing it wasn't true. Alex sighed and looked at the ground. Below him, the thundering underworld was rumbling. Jason knew what was on Alex's mind. Fred and Plutarch. Sure, the 3 of them had made it, and yes, it looked like the world would never know the horror of the plutonium boss. But it came at a price. Small as it may have been, it would have always hurt. Life would never be the same without the 2 pets they had tried in vain to save. Eve took a sniff left, then right. Her face curled into a sneer. "This is the atmosphere you breathe?" Jason held back a smile. "Yes, is something wrong?" "It is rich in stink factor," Alex said with a straight face. "Yes, quite stinked," Eve replied, her nose still twitching. "I do not know if I could get used to it." Jason couldn't hold it any longer. He burst into giggles, rolling on the swamp floor. In an instant he was covered with mud, but he didn't mind. He was home, stinked or not. With a smile on his face, he stretched out right then and there and fell fast asleep. And now a game hint from your friends at Geekade.com. To defeat the underbosses on level 2, 4, 6, and 7, try this technique. Use the A button to fire grenades as quickly as possible. When the underboss starts flashing white, hit the pause button. Wait about 30 seconds, then resume. You'll discover that he's dead. Well, now there's an actual pretty good game hint, but you don't have to wait 30 seconds. In my humble experience, all you need to do is wait until the sound effect changes, because there's a different sound effect for the boss actually dying and the sound of him getting hurt. So, yeah, once you hear the sound effect change, you're good to unpause it, and that underboss will be dead, dead, dead. Chapter 25. Federal officials expressed surprise at the magnitude of yesterday's quake. There is a minor fault line approximately under batrachia, they say, but the chance of feeling a tremor is about 1 in 13 million. The sound of the kitchen radio drifted into Jason's room the next morning, waking him up. As he did every Sunday morning, he thrust the pillow over his head and tried to go back to sleep. And as he did every Sunday morning, he realized it wasn't going to work. It was time to get up. But when his eyes popped open, a flood of images popped into his head. Sophia the Third, Eve, Alex, voices, robots, horrible laughter, horrible writing, just kidding. Jason sat bolt upright. It was a dream, wasn't it? It had to be. He was filled with happiness and relief. Imagine thinking he had plunged underground and chased after a plutonium mutant. Imagine thinking he had actually lost Fred. Fred! He hopped out of bed and ran to Fred's habitat. When his head began to pound like John Henry's hammer, he knew something had happened. When he looked into Fred's home, he knew he hadn't been dreaming. It was empty. Letting out a deep sigh, he sank back into bed. He was barely aware when his parents called up to say they were going shopping. He was barely aware of the doorbell ring minutes later. Or was it hours later? Jason didn't know and didn't care. But it rang a second time, and a third. Each ring pulsed through him like a mild electric shock. Jason was annoyed. He wanted to tell whoever it was to leave him alone. He stood up and shuffled downstairs. Bring! Jason wished his parents had gotten a doorbell that didn't sound like the bell that rang between classes. He clutched the doorknob and pulled it open. Rebeek! He jumped clear off the ground. It was a frog, as tall as he was, with a grimace that turned his face into a mask of evil. No! Jason shouted. He scrambled to his feet. How could this have happened? How could this thing have escaped? He was numb with terror. Without thinking, he slammed the door shut. Yow! Came a muffled voice from the other side. Hey, come on, is that any way to treat a friend? Jason stared blankly at the door. He knew that voice. Confused, he opened it again. Alex? He said. The latex frog head hung limp in Alex's right hand. Alex scratched his head, which was peeking out of a green frog costume. Behind him, Eve was rolling in the front lawn with laughter. I was going to say trick or treat, Alex said, but I guess you already decided against the treat. Sorry, Jason said. I thought you were... I know, Alex replied. You thought I was underboss number 7, your mutated pet frog. You mean to tell me you'd slam the door if your own pet frog came to it? Well, no, of course not, but... Then how come you did? Jason fell silent. He stared at Alex, befuddled. But I didn't... It was you. Are you being weird again? Ribbit. Jason felt a pang. The noise sounded so much like Fred. He could feel his heart breaking. That was a good imitation, Alex. But I wish you wouldn't. Ribbit. Alex shook his head. Couldn't do it if I tried. How about looking down, buddy? You won't make eye contact up there. Jason lowered his eyes. When his gaze reached the front mat, it stayed there. He felt his blood pounding through his veins. He felt his vision get blurry, then sharp again. Sharp enough to see that Fred was at his feet. Sharp enough to see that little hint of a frog smile on his face. He kneeled down. He picked the frog up in his hand. It is you, isn't it? Ribbit, came the answer. Jason felt his eyes start to water, until Alex let out a loud groan. Oh, please! I thought the soaps didn't start for a couple of hours. It was then that Jason noticed the lobster crawling on the lawn behind Alex. Plutarch? Jason asked. In the flesh, Alex answered. What? How? Hey, don't knock it, Alex said. Why ask questions? Eve stepped up to Jason's doorstep. I believe I know, she said. Remember the first underboss? It was nothing but a pure nuclear creation. Well, I think they were all like that, really. But the plutonium boss thought he could scare you by covering them with grotesque images of familiar objects. Like Fred and Plutarch, Jason said. Exactly. But how could they have possibly escaped? You underestimate the power of a pet to follow its master, Eve replied. My theory is that they were being held somewhere close to us. When we escaped, they found a way to chase after us. And we were so frantic we didn't see them stowing away, Alex added. Ribbit. Fred agrees, Jason said with a smile. He looked at Alex, then at Eve. Suddenly his face got serious. What about you, Eve? Where will you go now? I have told Alex's parents about my past, Eve said. Jason was shocked. What? They love that kind of stuff, Alex said. We'll tell everybody that Eve is a distant cousin who's been orphaned, and Mom and Dad had to take her in. Eve promised to tell them all kinds of outer space stories. And in return, they promised they would never spill the prunes about me. Ribbit. Fred says beans, Eve. I have a feeling you better stay away from the sling for a while. Alex tried to hold back a giggle, but it was hopeless. Jason joined him, and then Eve. And as Fred and Plutarch stared in confusion, their masters shared their first good laugh together. The first of many. The end. And now a note from FX9. Dear reader, I hope you liked reading Blaster Master. Here's a list of some other books that I thought you might like. A Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. My Teacher is an Alien by Bruce Coville. Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein. The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. The White Mountains Trilogy by John Christopher. A Wrinkle in Time by Madeline L'Engle. You can find these books at your local library or bookstore. Ask your teacher or librarian for other books you might enjoy. Best wishes, FX9.
And best wishes from me, Chris Randazzo, from Geekade.com.